the core issue is the medicalization. It's not, obviously you're medicalizing people for no freaking reason. There's no actual scientific proof behind that. But the bigger issue, and I think the issue we've all been struggling with now, as we see in just like what we reported on today, is the law side of it. Adults can do whatever they want. They can go have plastic surgery. That's fine. If someone wanted to have plastic surgery to appear as the opposite sex and try to live as the opposite sex, okay, whatever. But how do we handle that in law? The problem we've gotten into is law has now allowed people to falsify their documentation and say that their sex is not what it is and their name is not what it is. And that has the effect of then allowing folks, men, for example, who to go into women's spaces, women's sports, all this stuff, right? Because you're recognizing them as women because they did this medical thing or because they just say they are.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for January 17th, 2025. We are here with Carol and me, Arianne. First, a summary of today's news. An Ohio teacher wins her case over forced pronoun use. Sall Grover offers an update on the Tickle versus Giggle case. The Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act passes the House. Growing collaboration between Bari, Weiss, and Briannu sparks controversy. But first, we have a recording of Tim sharing his own news update.
The Washington Blade reports that Argentine President Javier Milei has significantly rolled back, quote, LGBTQ plus protections during his first year in office, prompting alarm among activists and human rights organizations. These measures include dismantling the Ministry of Women, Gender, and Diversity, a key body advocating for, quote, LGBTQ plus rights, and banning gender-inclusive language in public institutions. Milei has framed these actions as a rejection of gender ideology. The Blade highlights that the closure of institutions like the National Institute Against Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Racism has removed crucial anti-discrimination protections for both trans-identifying and gay individuals. The Blade also notes that these changes have disproportionately impacted marginalized groups. Over 100 trans-identifying public employees hired under previous inclusion quotas have been dismissed due to Milei's austerity measures. Activists have warned that without these institutional protections, discrimination is likely to increase across Argentina. Milei's policies have sparked significant protests, with thousands gathering in Buenos Aires to denounce what they call a rollback of human rights. One protester told reporters, quote, "This government is dismantling everything that made Argentina a leader in equality."
And now I'll hand it to you, Carol.
Thanks, Arianne. So we're going to go to Ohio first. In a significant legal development, the Jackson Local School District in Ohio has agreed to a $450,000 settlement with former middle school teacher Vivian Garotti. The settlement resolves a lawsuit initiated by Vivian, who claimed she was compelled to resign in 2022 after refusing to address two trans-identified students by their preferred names and pronouns, citing her religious beliefs. So she's saying it's a compelled speech issue. And just for anybody who doesn't know exactly what that entails, compelled speech occurs when the government or another authority mandates that an individual or organization express certain opinions or messages, even if they don't agree with them. This can take many forms, from forcing businesses to display slogans or signs, to requiring individuals to use specific language, such as preferred pronouns. Vivian is being represented by the Alliance Defending Freedom. She argues that the district's policy infringed upon her First Amendment rights by compelling her to participate in the social transition of students against her moral convictions. In August 2024, the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Ohio ruled that the school's policy was not neutral and constituted compelled speech, leading to the recent settlement. Her case illustrates how the rise of gender identity-related policies intersect with fact-based views on sex and language. This encourages further scrutiny of the potential unintended consequences of imposing strict language rules on employees. This case underscores the ongoing national debate over the balance between educators' religious freedoms and the rights of trans-identified students in the educational setting. The Jackson Local School District has not issued a public statement regarding this settlement. Now we go to some news out of Australia. There's an update in the Tickle versus Giggle court case. Brief background for those who may not have followed this case. Giggle is a woman-only networking app out of Australia owned by Sall Grover. A male named Roxy Tickle, who identifies as a woman, brought a human rights claim against Sall Grover for not permitting him to use her female-only app. We will provide a link to Giggle's crowdfunding page where you can learn more about this case and donate to the cause if you want to. So Wednesday, Sal posted the following on her X account. Quote, Giggle versus Tickle updates. Tickle has applied to cross appeal, wanting the decision upgraded from indirect discrimination to direct discrimination, plus more money in damages and money in aggravated damages. The Australian Human Rights Sex Discrimination Commissioner has once again applied to intervene. They intervened in the Tickle versus Giggle and interpreted the law to favor gender identity over sex, legal sex over biological sex. She goes on to say that the Australian Christian lobby has appealed to intervene on the side of sex-based rights. The case management hearing is scheduled for February 12th at the federal court in Sydney. So the federal court in Sydney will be 3 federal court judges, not 1, due to the cross appeal. The hearing is likely to go for 3 or 4 days rather than the usual 1 in an appeal. The reasons the Giggle appeal is to the full federal court and not the high court is because the Tickle versus Giggle decision got both facts about the case and facts about the law wrong. So it remains a federal court matter. After a full federal court appeal decision, the side who didn't get the decision in their favor can apply to go to the high court. She says, as I have said from the very beginning, I am willing to do that if that is what is necessary. She goes on to list what the legal team is and a few other details. We will keep you posted on this story. This has been ongoing for about 3 years, and I don't know, I personally hope she wins. Arianne?
Thank you, Carol. So on Tuesday, January 14th, the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act passed the House of Representatives. This bill bans males, including ones that identify as trans, from competing on female sports teams at schools and applies to all schools that receive federal funding from kindergarten through university. This includes public schools, but also includes most private universities as well. This bill also explicitly states that, quote, for the purposes of this subsection, sex shall be recognized based solely on a person's reproductive biology and genetics at birth, unquote. 2 Democrats, Henry Hajar and Vicente Gonzalez, both from Texas, joined Republicans in voting yes. 1 more Democrat, Don Davis of North Carolina, voted present. All these Democrats have narrowly won races in districts that are becoming more Republican. No Democrats voted for this bill when it came up in 2023. In addition, 3 Republicans and 6 Democrats abstained from the bill. 4 of these Democrats who abstained came from California, including, interestingly, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who is from San Francisco. Why Pelosi abstained, whether she was just busy or actually felt the heat from local turf activists in San Francisco, remains uncertain. The debate in the House on this bill proved to be quite bitter. Representative Jerry Nadler from New York called the bill a, quote, cruel attack on transgender children, unquote. Another New York representative, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, accused proponents of the bill of advocating genital examinations on little girls. She also emphasized that, quote, trans girls are girls, end quote, and that the bill opens the window for women to, quote, try to perform a very specific kind of femininity for the very kind of men drafting the bill, unquote. It's not clear what she meant by this, given that the bill defines sex according to biology, not gender stereotypes. She also went on to say that bigoted folks and assaulters love the bill, as well as CEOs, because, quote, Los Angeles is on fire right now, and this is the #1 priority this majority has, unquote. Other Democrats, like Representative Becca Balint from Vermont, Val Hoyle from Oregon and Sarah Jacobs from California doubled down on the argument that this bill enables genitalia checks and went so far as to speak in front of a poster with the words, quote, "the GOP Child Predator Empowerment Act," end quote. I would argue that the fact that Democratic opponents of the bill are making such hyperbolic ad hominem arguments shows that they know that they cannot come up with substantive arguments that will convince reasonable people. They know this is an unpopular issue for their side, and they are spewing all the vitriol they can to distract from that. All that Democratic resistance aside, it does look likely that this bill will ultimately become law. The bill now heads to the Senate, where it is likely to pass given that Republicans now have a majority holding 53 seats over the Democrats' 47. And Trump, who will be sworn in on January 20th, will likely sign it into law. However, even if it does become law, there is still a question about scope and enforcement. Some states have laws that require that schools allow trans-identified boys onto their girls' sports teams. How will schools in such states handle the question of contradictory state and federal laws? There will likely be lawsuits. Also, even if the federal ban ultimately triumphs over state laws, this would not entirely resolve the question of males on female sports teams. For example, what about private grade schools that don't typically get federal funds? Just this past Tuesday, January 14th, the San Francisco Waldorf School's basketball team, which has a trans-identified male player named Henry Hanlon, beat Jewish Community High School. The final score was 59-33, with Henry Hanlon scoring 29 of those points. Plus, there is the issue of professional sports, which would not be included in this bill. So while this bill, if it does ultimately pass, would indeed be a big fight in the victory to protect women and girls' single-sex sports, the battle would still continue. Now we're going to move to a social media kerfuffle. Social media is on fire over the burgeoning collaboration between Brianna Wu and Bari Weiss. Let me give some background on this controversy. For those of you who don't know, Wu is an American computer programmer and video game developer. In addition to being embroiled in the Gamergate controversy, Wu in 2018 launched an unsuccessful bid for Congress as a Democrat in the greater Boston area. However, more recently, Wu has drifted away from progressive politics and moved more towards the center. One factor that makes this interesting is that Wu is a trans-identified male. And while Wu claims to be critical of the excesses of trans activism, as I'll explain later, the reality is complicated. Now, as for Bari Weiss, she is a former New York Times reporter who left the Times in 2020, claiming she was unfairly bullied by her more progressive colleagues over her criticism of social justice politics. She then started the Free Press and the Honestly podcast. The Free Press and Honestly podcast have become an important voice for many on the disaffected left. That is, people who formerly considered themselves left-wing and/or Democrats, but think the whole progressive movement has gone way too far in its embrace of things such as identity politics. Now, the disaffected left includes many critics of gender ideology, but how far does Bari Weiss herself go? Weiss invited Brianna Wu onto her podcast in October of last year, where they bonded over what they perceive as the excesses of the far left. In particular, both are staunch supporters of Israel and critics of pro-Palestinian activism. Apparently, Weiss was so impressed with Wu, she invited Wu back to her podcast for a January 14th episode. But not everyone is happy about this collaboration. Lena Goldis, aka the Unyielding Bicyclist, a lesbian lawyer and critic of transgender medicine and politics, wrote on X, quote, "Disappointed to see Bari Weiss chaining herself to Brianna Wu in a regular podcast. The Free Press could have been the first outlet to report trans is a belief system with no grounding in science. Now it won't be." Unquote. Such sentiment is representative of the wider gender-critical distrust of Brianna Wu. For example, going all the way back to May of last year, Wu had quite a heated debate with Mina Paley on her Heterodorks podcast. Paley is a feminist critic of transgender activism. Many women's rights advocates see Wu as endorsing caricatures of femininity in order to insist that trans women are women. For example, in December of last year, J.K. Rowling criticized an ex-post Wu had made, in which Wu writes, quote, "I know there is an angry crowd that will never believe trans women are an admittedly weird variation of women. But for people in the middle, here's 25 minutes of dollcast show just talking about doing our hair. Can anyone say that we would make sense living as men?" End quote. Furthermore, some anti-gender ideology activists have called out Wu for what they feel is hypocrisy. While Wu has complained about cross-dressing fetishists infiltrating transgender activism, presumably a reference to autogynephiles, many feminists and other gender criticals believe Wu is in fact an autogynephile. More recently, on January 16th, radical feminist lawyer Kara Dansky said in a retweet response to Wu, quote, "You are a cross-dressing fetishist," unquote. This kerfuffle is illustrative of the conflicting priorities within the center and disaffected left. There is a whole spectrum of views on gender in that political space. How far of a critique of transgender activism is enough? Is it enough to criticize activists on certain specific things, perhaps, for example, on child medicalization, while still holding to some belief in true trans for adults? Or should the very idea of transgender medicine itself, including for adults, be rejected? And with Wu's collaboration, will the free press tack towards the former view, embracing true trans, in which case who will platform the latter view, rejecting true trans? So what do you think about this, Carol?
My first question, I feel, to cut through it all would be, what is the core problem with trans ideology or the belief that someone is trans? Well, for you, what is the core issue here?
See, the way I see it is there's sort of two issues in parallel. One is the actual medical scientific debate, like, is there any way we can have any basis for transgender, anything that we can observe scientifically and hence can treat in any sort of medical way? And then there's also this more sort of, I'd say, overarching political debate, which is, okay, is it possible to, putting aside the whole medical issue, is it possible to simply have some sort of, what's the role that the government plays in acknowledging any sort of transgender identities?
So we have the medical part of it, the idea that some people are helped by the medicalization of their bodies. And then we have the law part of it, right? Where do these folks who want to live as the sex they are not fit into law, and how do we as a society deal with this situation? Do you kind of are on the same
Yeah,
page
I see that. And I think that for a lot of people, they don't really think much about the medical and scientific aspect, except for maybe like some little things like I said, like child medicalization. They'll say, well, I don't want that. But they're really, I don't think very many people from the wider public are really aware of the history of transgender medicine as a field. And so I
Yeah.
think for a lot of people, they just sort of import a lot of assumptions that they've heard from activists or maybe even from individual trans identifying people that they know. And so that's informing a lot of their own policy views.
Yeah, and I think Unyielding Bicyclist is written a lot on this, so that's a good source to go read up on the whole history of the medicalization, which is nonsense. It's all nonsense. But she says belief system, right? And I think it is a belief system. I would go even further and say it's a cult. I say this as having had my own experience identifying as trans and going through transition, right? I've been on that side of the coin. And for me, it really is a cult. So My biggest issue with this is, why are we allowing people who are still in a cult to come onto the side that's trying to fight against the cult? Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I feel like if you let one in, the rest are going to come, kind of thing. It's tricky, right? It's kind of like it's very pervasive, like a virus. They want to get their foot in the door there so they could still retain this kind of idea that there are really trans people. And the core issue is the medicalization. It's not, obviously you're medicalizing people for no freaking reason. There's no actual scientific proof behind that. But the bigger issue, and I think the issue we've all been struggling with now, as we see in just like what we reported on today, is the law side of it. Okay, that's fine. People can do whatever, adults can do whatever they want. They can go have plastic surgery. That's fine. If someone wanted to have plastic surgery to appear as the opposite sex and try to live as the opposite sex, okay, whatever. But how do we handle that in law? The problem we've gotten into is law has now allowed people to falsify their documentation and say that their sex is not what it is and their name is not what it is. And that has the effect of then allowing folks, men, for example, who to go into women's spaces, women's sports, all this stuff, right? Because you're recognizing them as women because they did this medical thing or because they just say they are.
Right. And I would say, I mean, the problem is how, when people talk about, okay, adults can do what they want with their body. The thing is that doesn't give you a right to infringe on other people's rights. So you can't, like, if a male wants to transition and now begin living as a woman, okay, you can say, like, sure, you can make that claim about yourself, but when you say, like, oh, well, then you have a right to use women's facilities, be on women's sports teams, then you're running into the problem of women's rights. So that's one issue. And if we respect it as a religion or as a belief system, with religion, there are laws that require reasonable accommodations for religious beliefs. And I'm not an expert on this, but for example, suppose someone wanted to, for some reason, their holy day was Wednesday, and they wanted to get all of they're working as a school teacher, and they wanted to get all of Wednesday off because, it's part of their religion to go to church or whatever on a Wednesday. That's not really a reasonable demand to make because that's completely interfering with your duties as a teacher, where you're supposed to be there during the normal school day. But if it's something very minor, like for some reason the school is not letting you do a prayer at lunchtime, like, maybe you're Muslim and you have a prayer schedule and there's a way you can do your prayers that does not really interfere with your work duties, then that's a reasonable accommodation. Or, things like with sometimes with clothing, like with headscarves and that sort of thing. So with the transgender thing, you could say like maybe certain clothing things could be a reasonable accommodation. But when it comes to like using the facilities of the opposite sex because you identify as stuff, that would not be a reasonable accommodation. That's how I would read it.
And I'm gonna clue people in here. Trans-identified folks, for most of them, especially guys like Wu, they want to be seen as women. That's the whole point. They want to live in this women role. Okay. That entails everything, right? I highly doubt he is using his, birth name and his biological sex on his marker, on his ID and stuff. I'd be very surprised if he hasn't changed that over. I'd be very surprised if he's using all male facilities. So you have to ask yourself, is it even possible for someone to be trans-identified and not infringe across these lines in society and people's spaces? I would say probably not, because then if you're just a guy dressed in a dress, you're a guy dressed in a dress. I don't feel that's going to get them what they want. And I don't think that is going to really fly either. Like, then you're just a guy in a dress and that's fine, but that's not what they want to be. Like, that's the point that's being missed here. And so it's like, you can't, I don't know how you respect the trans-identified person who wants to live with the opposite sex in society. How does that work?
Yeah, and my guess, I mean, my read of someone like Bari Weiss, I can't say I'm like an avid follower of hers. I do occasionally see, like, read stuff from the Free Press or her podcast. I was never a paid subscriber, but the impression I get is that this probably isn't her pet issue. Like, with the transgender stuff, it's probably, I don't get the impression that this is an issue where she's really dug into those very deep, important questions about how that's going to work. And so for her, it seems like as long as you have some critique of, what she thinks is like sort of the extreme left,
But
then
this is
in particular Israel, that's her
oh,
issue. And
okay.
Brianna Wu is very pro-Israel. So
Okay.
that would be my read, is that she's probably not all that interested in the depths of the gender wars.
But like in your reporting on it, you said that she's really taken issue with identity politics, right? So isn't the whole trans thing really just like the ultimate child of identity politics?
I mean, I would say so, because it's based on this idea that how you identify trumps how you're born. Like, I mean, I feel like it's an issue that's really hard to untangle with identity politics. But I guess for some people, I think on a more superficial level, criticizing identity politics simply just means criticizing people that are in your demographic group. Sort of being a contrarian within your demographic group is enough. And so Brianna Wu has sometimes criticized transgender activists. That's framed as, anti-identity politics.
And she just, and the folks that support this just don't see the double standard here and the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
For my opinion, it's utter hypocrisy to say one's okay and one's not. Why? It's basically like, if a Republican does something, then you don't like, you're like, that's a horrible person. They did a horrible thing. But if the Democrat does the same thing, you're like, oh, we'll just overlook that. And that's the problem right now. That is the big problem. Let's not overlook any bad thing or any horrible policy anybody does, regardless of who they are identifying with, what party, what group, right? That's the problem.
Yeah, we need to actually dig in and look at the ideas themselves and critique the ideas themselves, and not think like, oh, well, I know that person's on my team, so
Right.
their ideas must be okay, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So then this presents the whole question of, as I asked, the free press, I think a lot of people had high expectations for the free press because of their niche in the culture wars, that they could, be a good platform for more critiques of transgender ideology. And so some people are disappointed by this, because it seems like they're going to only take a very shallow stab into the issue. But
And when somebody or a organization or news organization takes a very shallow approach to the trans issue, you have to wonder what other issues they're taking a very shallow approach to, because this is such a very, in my opinion, a very black and white kind of issue. Like, there is some facts and there are some not facts, some lies involved here. And critical thinking, if you just put any kind of critical thinking into it, it completely falls apart. So if I kind of look at some of these other news organizations that pop up and want to do a better job or whatever than the left media or the right media. I would hope that the goal would be for critical thinking, fact-based reporting, and logic. And it doesn't seem that's the case.
yeah, unfortunately. Thank you, everyone. That was a great episode. I hope you join us again next week.